Summer is not here anymore, but the time is still right for some prog rock. Yeah, sorry this took a while to get out. First I broke my hand, and then I was sick for 2.5 weeks. I tried to call Biggles last Saturday, and I didn't know where the hell he was. But we are wrapping up Summer of Prog, or I guess now Autumn of Prog, with a classic from 1972. And I want to give a special shout out to my patron, Aden M, who donated this copy of Jethro Tull's Thick as a Brick. Or as I should title this, how many Monty Python clips can I possibly fit into one video? Jethro Tull is sort of the underdog band when it comes to discussing the classic progressive rock bands. They don't come up as often as Pink Floyd, Genesis, or Yes, but that didn't stop me from giving them a brief mention in the History of Rock 70s video. Well, back then, you could be a hard rock band with a 40-minute song, and even have a long flute solo in the middle of it. I mean, really, what's more prog rock than an album that's one 43-minute song split up over 2 sides? But also what separates Jethro Tull is their sense of humor. Thick as a Brick took inspiration from Monty Python, hence the disclaimer in the beginning, and with frontman Ian Anderson's unique songwriting and iconic stage persona, complemented by some musicianship that could even contend with Emerson, Lake and Palmer, this album really is a staple among 70s prog classics. To tell the history of the album, we gotta go back to the previous one, Aqualung. By this point, Tull had a few albums under their belt, mostly channeling the blues rock sound at the time, although their arrangement of Bach's Bourrée from Stand Up garnered some attention, especially with Ian's flute front and center. But Aqualung is the album that brought the band into the top 10 in the US, and also started to establish the Thick as a Brick lineup with Ian Anderson, Marty Barre on guitar, Ian's school friends Jeffrey Hammond and John Evan on bass and keyboards respectively, and soon-to-be-replaced original drummer Clive Bunker. Songs like Aqualung and My God, the former being a staple of classic rock radio, I'm feeling like a dead duck, presented a very theatrical vibe with changing dynamics and sounds, and had recurring themes throughout the album regarding organized religion's negative effect on society, which naturally led the public to describing it as a concept album, even if Ian disagreed, claiming it was really just a collection of songs with some connecting themes throughout it. Personally, I can see why someone would describe Aqualung as such. It's true that some songs, like Locomotive Breath, are their own thing, but some of these shorter acoustic pieces sound like they'd be more at home pieced together with other songs, kind of like what the Beatles did on Abbey Road. I started feeling a little more confident about singer-songwriter kind of music, and strumming the guitar and singing songs and not using all the band all the time for everything, Aqualung is a very good album, especially My God. That would be my essential track. Holy Jesus, that song rocks so hard, and probably features some of Ian Anderson's best flute playing. But in retrospect, you do see how the songs on this album could work as an interconnected larger piece. So with this new label thrust upon them, Jethro Tull decided they would make the mother of all concept albums. As I mentioned, there would be one more lineup change with drummer Barrymore Barlow.
He became, in my mind, one of the first drummers to actually put musical parts into the band that were going to be there forever.
And Ian got to work on writing the piece.
I mean, I just kept writing until I had a lot of music, and that was an album.
Apparently this was done very fast, Ian writing part of the piece in the morning, the band working out the new material in the studio, tying it together with what they had worked out the previous days, and recording everything within a matter of weeks with Robin Black as their engineer. That's unbelievable considering the complexity of this piece. Despite this being Ian's baby, the whole band chipped in with ideas, especially John Evan, who served as this album's Keith Emerson, if you will. But before we dive into the music, we gotta talk about this album cover. This really is one of the most elaborate covers I've ever come across, acting as sort of a mock newspaper called the St. Cleeve Chronicle. I mean, just look at this thing. It really does feel like you're reading a newspaper from the 70s. Not to mention the fact that they spent more time on this album cover than they did on the music itself. While the articles were written by Ian, Jeffrey Hammond, and John Evan, A&R man Roy Eldridge designed the cover itself.
Every photograph, features friends of the group, there's members of the road crew.
The front page tells the story of a boy genius named Gerald Bostock, aka Little Milton. Seriously, this kid's expression is priceless. Who composed a poem for a youth contest which acts as the lyrics for the piece and are printed on page 7. The headline reads that Milton was disqualified in last-minute rumpus, and it really does feel like a comedic bit that John Cleese would actually read on Monty Python's Flying Circus. A hastily reconvened panel of judges accepted the decision by 4 leading child psychiatrists that the boy's mind was seriously unbalanced and that his work was a product of an extremely unwholesome attitude towards life, his God, and country. The first prize will now be presented to runner-up Mary Whiteyard, age 12, for her essay on Christian ethics entitled, "He Died to Save the Little Children." And you might be thinking, does this have anything to do with the song itself? Well, I'll get to that in a minute. There's some pretty funny articles here. Magistrate finds himself, roller skate champ passes through, non-rabbit missing. And fun fact, when they would perform this entire album live, they would break up the 2 record sides by having Jeffrey Hammond read some mock news and weather, including the non-rabbit story, complete with a report from rabbit expert Dr. Farley Ruskin. That's Dr. Farley right there. There's even a Connect the Dots feature, and I can already tell this is going to be something naughty. They even have a review of the album. Man, talk about meta. It's a nice spoof on contemporary music journalism, but it also serves as a way to list the band members and album info. Honestly, you can really get lost reading this thing. That's why it's great to have on vinyl. But hey, we're here to talk about the music, so let's get into it. The first time I listened to this album, already knowing that it was a record-long piece, I guess I expected the opening to be more like the iconic guitar riff on Aqualung, but with that waltzing acoustic guitar and flute, it sounds more like we should be at a Renaissance fair. Ian revealed to have grown up listening to Scottish folk music because, well, he's from Scotland. So already, this album is a pretty big departure from their heavy blues sound, but it's a welcome change. I really have to give credit to Ian's acoustic guitar picking. Despite considering himself an inferior player, he really makes these polyrhythms dance with some quirky textures from the rest of the band. And lyrically, he seems to break the fourth wall with the first line.
Really don't mind if you sit this one out.
As if to say, yeah, we're doing something a little different here. If you're not into it, that's cool. But the line that really cements the opening is, I may make you feel, but I can't make you think.
Your sperm's in the gutter, your love's in the sink.
Who said that? The title, Thick as a Brick, obviously means hard-headed.
Your wise men don't know how it feels to be thick as a brick, so how the hell can they decide for the man in the street?
And the main theme seems to center around the divide between class structure and even the generational divide. That's probably the main inspiration for including the Little Milton story on the cover. Honestly, I went into a pretty heavy deep dive trying to analyze these lyrics and pick up on all the nuances. A lot of Tull fans seem to imply that it's useless trying to make sense of them because the band's really just parodying prog bands that take themselves too seriously. And that may be true, but I don't think you can just write these lyrics off as meaningless silliness. They really are very provocative and incredibly well composed.
These were the years of Monty Python, which is a substantially British kind of approach to humor, that rather surrealistic approach.
It really needs to be emphasized that Monty Python's Flying Circus was huge in Britain at this time. They were practically rock stars in their own right. And while they certainly were known for being outstandingly silly,
I think this is getting too silly.
Quite agree. Silly, silly, silly.
Monty Python was still based around a lot of satirical commentary that was ruthlessly iconoclastic.
The 127th Upper Class Twit of the Year show. Nigel Incubator Jones, his best friend is a tree, and in his spare time he's a stockbroker. Gervais Brook Hamster, he's in the wine trade, and his father uses him as a waste paper basket.
The first sketch I ever saw of Monty Python was The Ministry of Silly Walks, which on the surface seems pretty random and meaningless, though funny. But just the image of John Cleese as this upper-crust bureaucrat in a boiler hat walking in this ridiculous manner, government-funded, mind you, is political satire in and of itself.
Last year, the government spent less on the Ministry of Civil Defence than it did on national defence.
They would also satirize how they covered contemporary issues on the BBC, which is still relevant to this day.
Well, this is largely as I predicted, except that the silly party won. I think this is mainly due to the number of votes cast.
Look, I could go on and on about Monty Python, but this is Jethro Tull's video. And yeah, so much of this album has to do with those same satirical jabs at the class system and British values. I've come down from the upper class to mend your rotten ways. But there is that added dissection of prog lyrics, with all these visual metaphors and heavy-handed messages we discussed in Circus and Court of the Crimson King. The only thing is that Ian writes them so well, you can interpret them in any way you want. But anyway, let's not get too carried away here. Let's go back to the beginning. So although Thick as a Brick is just one long song across two sides of the record, the streaming version splits it into 8 separate tracks with content titles. The opening Renaissance bit is called Really Don't Mind, but then the band builds up to this rockin' beat for the next song, See There a Son Is Born. And again, these lyrics do seem to authentically challenge what civil society expects of the younger generation, to go to war, to go to trade school, and according to Ian, they do stem from his own educational experiences. And musically, it's very complex as well. We've got this moving bass line in 5/4, unique textures with horns played by Ian himself, John's modulating organ lines a la Keith Emerson. There's a lot of energy in this section to counterpoint the folk music we heard in the beginning, but the transition is seamless. We also get some fine soloing from John Evan on organ and Martin Barre on guitar. Some of these syncopated lines are even King Crimson worthy. But then we crash into the next section, The Poet and the Painter, with Jeffrey's gnarly bass, and this is the first time we get a proper flute solo from Ian. Funny enough, the entire reason Ian became a flute player, which he was teaching himself to play while they were gigging, was that as a guitarist, he didn't want to be compared with the other guitar gods of the time.
I found a way to make it work by singing and grunting the notes in a very forceful way.
And again, his rock and roll flute playing is what gave Jethro Tull their iconic sound. Also worth noting, Ian is an incredible frontman. Any clip you can find of him is just so entertaining to watch. You can see why the satirical nature of the piece suits him so well. The second half of this section is the closest we get to that blues rock sound of the previous albums, really showcasing Martin's guitar. Marty is a very good guitar player, even if he's sometimes overshadowed a bit by Ian's more unconventional flute riffing. It's really when the two of them come together on that riff that it becomes so memorable. John Evan's classical rock-style keyboards really shine during these transitions and What Do You Do When the Old Man's Gone, and one of my favorite parts of the piece, From the Upper Class. It's like a little Scottish jig with a violin played by Ian tucked away in the mix. Honestly, I couldn't help but dance when I was listening to it.
I've come down from the upper class to mend your rotten ways.
Yeah, I clearly can't dance at all. And again, that generational divide rears its head in the lyrics again.
So come on, all you criminals, I've got to put you straight. Just like I did with my old man 20 years too late.
With a brief reprise of the acoustic picking in Curl Your Toes and Fun, we come to this side's climax with Childhood Heroes, where Ian calls upon fictional characters to lead the government, which probably makes just as much sense as people who actually run the government.
Superman for president, let Robin save the day.
Robin? What the hell is Robin gonna do?
So where the hell was Biggles when you needed him last Saturday?
Oh, I just found out where Biggles was.
Biggles! Put her in the comfy chair!
Man, I didn't expect the Spanish Inquisition to appear in this video.
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition.
And the piece returns to an instrumental with the synchronized stabs, ending on Martin's guitar echo and the sound of wind. We're about halfway through the piece, and with all this adventurous musicianship and finely crafted lyrics, you'd think this was a perfect album, right? Well...
You know we're in trouble when we hear the word, well.
Okay, would everybody stop cameoing in this video?
By the way, this one says breasts.
I do have one nitpick that I think is worth bringing up. Obviously, this is a long piece, twice as long as Circus or Close to the Edge, which I mentioned could be a lot to take in all at once. But what Thick as a Brick doesn't really have is those big changes of dynamics, like the I Get Up, I Get Down section in Close to the Edge, or the whale sound section of Echoes, both of which really give the listener a chance to chill out and take in what they're listening to. Even classical symphonies do this. Thick as a Brick doesn't really have that. Not to say it's void of dynamics or anything, but it's always moving. Which is why every time I get to the top of side 2, it starts to feel a little repetitive. Though, to be fair, that is the point. It's a reprise of See There a Man Is Born, only instead of him being pronounced fit to fight, they pronounce him fit for peace. Clearly the new generation, possibly the hippie generation, has come of age and taken over with their own ideals. You also notice that musically, we're now in 6/8 instead of 5/8. Barrymore gets a series of drum solos, and things start getting slightly avant-garde from here, right down to some spoken word sections from Jeffrey Hammond. And while all the transitions have been seamless up to this point, the reprising of the acoustic picking from the opening, here titled as Clear White Circles, feels the most abrupt. But I don't want you to think that I'm writing off side 2, because the piece does get its second wind with the section Believe in the Day. A beautiful acoustically driven piece that does give us something of a moment of contemplation. I love the vocal hook, the filter on Ian's flute, the way the band builds its dynamics. By itself, this could even be its own earnest piece with spiritual themes. Once again, we get a great musical transition into Tales of Your Life, and conceptually and thematically, this is the crux of the whole piece. The Tales of Your Life really refer to society's values and virtues that they use to justify war, oppression, and perpetuation of homelessness, all in the name of religious dogma.
Let me help you to pick up your dead.
Bring out your dead!
The message is not to follow the sins of your fathers.
And the necessity, I think, should be apparent for everyone to decide, to make their own judgment on things in their own way, regardless of age or experience or even intelligence.
And, well, to quote Monty Python years later in The Life of Brian, you've got to think for yourselves.
You're all different! Yes, we are all different! I'm not.
And once again, the band is just on fire with time changes, syncopated hits, and layers of unique instrumentation, like harpsichord and timpani, even an alarm clock. We hear a montage of reprisals from the different movements of the piece, notably Childhood Heroes, and no, they still don't know where the hell Biggles was last Saturday. And with barely a minute to spare, for the first time in the piece we hear an orchestra. Man, they didn't want to leave out any prog rock staples, did they? Arranged by their orchestrator, Dee Palmer, who would later tour as their second keyboardist. It's also kind of comical at just how random it is, just coming in at the end of the piece like this. And then, finally, we bookend with a return to Ian's original acoustic piece.
Ah, to be thick as a... Yes!
Phew, man, that was an adventure. And yeah, this is the kind of album that vinyl was made for. When you first listen to it, especially on a turntable, you're kind of just amazed by the size and scope of the piece, and the more you listen, the more you pick up on the musical nuances and lyrical subtleties. There are admittedly a couple moments when I tune out, but thankfully they're few and far between. Making a 43-minute piece is not easy. Jethro Tull set out to make the mother of all concept albums. Well, they certainly made a great one. But you might be thinking, were they really able to perform this entire piece live? Oh, you bet they were. Most of the footage I've shown so far is from their later tours, where they played a shorter, truncated version of the piece.
The famous Led Zeppelin's Whole Lotta Brick.
But on their 72 tour, they could stretch the song past the 1 hour mark with extended solos, that news break I mentioned earlier, even an urgent telephone call to interrupt the piece. And thankfully they would carry on with this lineup and creativity for a few more albums. 1973's A Passion Play being another album-length piece, but that's a story for another time. Jethro Tull's Thick as a Brick gets a goldfish from me. Like I said, even the newspaper album cover itself is worth having. The essential track? Thick as a Brick. Remember, please subscribe and like this video. It really helps me stand out in the YouTube algorithm. And if you can go that extra mile, consider joining my Patreon page where you can see an extended version of this video. Again, I want to give a huge thank you to Aden M for donating this copy, and thank you to everybody who joined me for Summer of Prog. Hey, maybe I'll do it again next year. But for now, I've got to talk about Frank Zappa. So I'll see you all next time.